Well, hello, everyone. I'm Bert Covert, professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder and co-chair of the American Society of Primatologists Conservation Committee. And I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's webinar titled Hunting, Wildlife Markets, and Food Security. I anticipate you will find this to be a very interesting and thought-provoking event. This webinar is being recorded and will be deposited on the ASP Conservation Videos page, and the recording will reside on our YouTube channel, AMSOC, Primatologists Conservation Committee. I also want to encourage you to consider making a cash donation to support conservation projects funded by the ASP Conservation Committee. And if you're not a member, think about joining the American Society of Primatologists. I want to thank Dr. Marilyn Norconk, my co-chair on the ASP Conservation Committee and Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Kent State University, for planning this event. This would not be happening without her dedicated efforts. I also want to thank Dr. Jennifer Kramer for her wonderful contributions to the virtual environment that's hosting this webinar. Jennifer is a primatologist and the program director for sociology, anthropology, and general studies at the American Public University. Before introducing the organizer of today's event, I want to remind all of you that the annual meeting of the American Society of Primatologists will be November 17th through 20 in Oklahoma City and will be in person. Proposals for symposia, workshops, and roundtables should be submitted between June 15th and June 30th, and abstracts should be submitted between June 15th and July 15th. Please plan on joining us for cutting-edge presentations on the ecology, behavior, anatomy, welfare, and conservation of captive and wild primates. Personally, I cannot wait to be able to meet with many of you once again in person in just under 8 months in Oklahoma City. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the organizer of today's webinar. Dr. Christopher Shaffer is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Grand Valley State University, whose research focuses on the ecological and social interactions between humans and non-human primates, particularly in the context of hunting and zoonotic disease. Dr. Shaffer is the principal investigator of the Knoshan Ecosystems Health Project, a partnership between the multidisciplinary team of researchers indigenous YY in Guyana, South America, focused on the long-term co-management of subsistence hunting and the prevention of zoonotic disease emergence. Dr. Shaffer's other research interests include the behavioral ecology of Piscine primates, particularly movement ecology and fission-fusion dynamics. So please take it away, Chris.
Well, thank you so much, Bert. And welcome everyone. Thank you all for participating in our webinar. From really all around the world, we have an incredible number of different countries represented. We had about 200 people register for the webinar. And we have a great group of presenters today. Cortni Borgerson, Carolyn Jost Robinson, and Roselis R. Now, the reason that we decided to organize this webinar is because, as most of you know, the hunting of primates and other wildlife is a huge conservation pressure and a major source of zoonotic disease emergence. However, it is also integral to the food security, livelihoods, and social lives of millions of people throughout the tropical world. As the current pandemic has brought increased attention to the threats posed by hunting and consumption of wildlife, it's really an urgent time to discuss this topic. So I'm very excited about the group of speakers that we have today, especially because they're not just ecologists able to talk about the impact of hunting on wildlife populations, but just as importantly, they are also able to speak to the complex sociocultural context of primate hunting, which is hugely important and I think sometimes a little bit lost in the conversation that has emerged about hunting since the COVID pandemic. So just a brief outline of the structure of the seminar. There will be 3 presentations, one by each of the presenters, followed each by a 5-minute question and answer session for that particular presenter. The question and answer function that you'll find at the bottom of Zoom can be used at any time for any presenter. So please post your questions there. After all of the speakers have presented, there will be a general 10 to 15 minute, depending on how much time we have, question and answer session with all speakers present. Finally, our last 15 minutes will consist of an after party with breakout rooms, where we'll be dividing the attendees into 4 breakout rooms, each hosted by one of the speakers, including myself. We're excited about this. We hope that this provides an opportunity for all of you to interact more closely with the speakers, with each of the speakers. And there will be a link that's sent out during the seminar for you to enter those breakout rooms when the time comes. So without further ado, let's get to our first presenter, which is, who is Cortni Borgerson. And Dr. Borgerson is an assistant professor of anthropology at Montclair State University, a National Geographic explorer, and a commission member for the IUCN Primate Specialist Group in Madagascar, who has worked with numerous conservation NGOs. Cortni is excited to share her work on lemur hunting in Madagascar and her efforts to simultaneously support both Madagascar's human and non-human primates.
Hi guys, you guys want everybody to see my screen? Okay, I'm assuming with good thumbs up and such. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you guys today about this relationship between primate hunting and food security, and in my case, in Madagascar. So Madagascar is one of the world's greatest conservation priorities. Might have a lot of lemur folks in the audience, I'm not quite sure. But it's also what you might not know. It's one of the greatest priorities for public health in the world as well. Madagascar actually has some of the world's lowest food security, as well as some of the world's highest malnutrition. And a lot of the efforts to address things like primate conservation and food security have been treated as these totally separate issues, which can be handled by completely different organizations on the ground, or when they're discussed together, sometimes they're set up as these really simple inverse correlations where either, food security is increasing at the expense of forests, or we end up conserving forests and reducing food security. But I'm really excited to talk to this group in particular today, and with everyone else that we have with us, about how these two are really deeply interconnected and how this interconnection between the two doesn't just inform our own research on how many primates are hunted or why people are hunting them, but it informs our own efforts to conserve these primates as well. And in my case, that's lemurs, which are amazing. They make up over 20% of the world's primate species. They're organized in these 8 different families. But out of those 8 families, we already have 3 that have gone extinct. And in fact, 98% of the species that are remaining are threatened with extinction from things like habitat loss and unsustainable hunting, which is why we're all here. Hunting in rural Madagascar is high. Nearly everyone eats a forest mammal or bird each and every year. 86% of the households that are bordering protected areas in Madagascar eat a forest mammal or bird each and every year. And 1 in 5 eat primates. And I'm assuming I've got primatologists out there, and the most common question I always get, right, is like, why are people eating my research subject? And in Madagascar, there's 3 main predictors for this. Basically, it comes down to the combinations between food insecurity, child malnutrition, and high biodiversity. And if I'm going to oversimplify it, it's that if you are so food insecure that it's starting to affect the health of your kids, and you have high biodiversity there to rely on, then you're going to use that high biodiversity to help support your livelihoods and well-being, whether or not you know that primate hunting is illegal, no matter how important you think that primates are in the ecosystem there, how risky you think that meat is. All of us, when it comes down to it, take the efforts that we need to support our own families. And in Madagascar, food insecurity is really high near protected areas. 78% of households are food insecure near a protected area. On average, they're food insecure for over half of the days during the prior week. Half of all the money that's spent in a household each and every week is spent on food. And rice is life in Madagascar, but most of the money, 75% of it, is actually spent on what we call like sauce foods. This is the meat or the vegetable that's going on top of your rice. And this is really important because it's not only where a lot of wildlife actually fill a role within the food system, but it's also a part of the diet that's extremely important for child malnutrition. So malnutrition in rural Madagascar is really high. Half of kids under 5 in Madagascar are stunted, which means that they're not reaching the range of height for their age that we really need them to be reaching for good health. About 40% are underweight and about 14% are too thin even for their short stature. But in this context, what's really interesting is when you actually split these households in rural Madagascar apart into households that are hunting primates and households that aren't, you can really see that the kids in these households of people who are trapping lemurs are really malnourished. In this case, you have almost all kids that are stunted, 75% are underweight, and nearly a third being wasted, which is really alarming and starts to explain why more individuals aren't following these types of behaviors. So those kids that are malnourished, it's not only that they're not doing particularly well, it's that the nutrition they're relying on or that they're getting is often depending on wildlife. So well over a third, and in some places close to half of, on average, the kilocalories, iron, quality protein, a lot of the different micronutrients that these kids are getting are coming from forest animals. And there's a wide variation between communities, but even on the low end for our lowest community that we've ever worked in, it's about 11% of all meat that's coming from the forest. And at the high end, it can be as much as 75% of all meat that's really depending on those forest ecosystems. And this is having a significant effect on primates in Madagascar. Remember, 88%, right, of these species are actually threatened. And a long time ago, when I first started working in this, we were trying to figure out how many lemurs were eaten where, right? And a lot of the news that was out there really focused on anecdotal pieces of information about species that we thought were hunted often or species that we thought weren't hunted often because of FADI, which are these systems of taboos, of proscriptions and prescriptions to protect both human public health and spiritual health across Madagascar. But now that we're really starting to understand what's happening across the country, we're able to really look at figuring out what lemur characteristics are driving hunting in Madagascar, and how do we use that to figure out which families of lemur are probably being hunted in places where we don't have any data at all. And when we looked at this, when we were trying to figure out, is it that rare lemurs are targeted or large lemurs, or is it just the lemurs that are most abundant in the system, we really found that abundance is driving most of the proportion of the lemurs that are being hunted in number. And this is really important when you start to think about the reasons why people are hunting and the relationship that it has with food security and what happens when you're relying on the animals that are available in the area to meet those needs. In Madagascar, this means now that we know that some of the species, when we're starting to think of this, that might have common stories about taboos against or for them, when put into that really complicated picture of food security, now we see that some of the species we thought weren't hunted very often are actually hunted quite often. And some of the species where there was a lot of stories about hunting are actually hunted quite rarely. And some of these species and the families of lemurs are actually being hunted quite a lot across the country. In fact, in raw numbers, the two most commonly hunted lemurs in Madagascar are the white-fronted brown lemur and the eastern dwarf lemur. You can see that a large number of these species are hunted each and every year in the 10 protected areas where we've been able to study them. But beyond the raw numbers, when we actually start looking at the proportion of the population that's being eaten each and every year for some of these critically endangered species, you get some really concerning lemur species with high levels of hunting. Things that we used to think were relatively low, like the indri, or species like Prolemur simus or Propithecus. And the problem is because we don't actually have a lot of good density data on all of these species where we understand hunting, it's actually very difficult to determine the full impacts on many of these different species. And so we have a scenario in Madagascar that is interesting and challenging and exciting in the role of biological anthropology and primatology, because we're working in many of these different planes in anthropology where we can start to look at the cultural roles and the health roles and the primates themselves in the same system. And where this is particularly useful in Madagascar when you have this scenario where the conservation of primates is depending on a food insecure population who's hunting them for food. So what we've been able to do is work with the communities to actually develop culturally appropriate, sustainable ways in order to improve their food systems using forest. And what I want to talk about with this is that we've been able to do this not by excluding forests, because oftentimes when you're excluding forests from food systems, you can actually end up doing things that are counterproductive to your inevitable goals and harm both conservation and public health. But because it's ignoring this important role and this interconnection between the forest and food security. So we've been really lucky to work with rural communities primarily in the Northeast, but now also in the Southeast of Madagascar, to develop methods to take sustainably sourced forest resources, which can be farmed. In this case, we're using traditionally eaten insects that taste like bacon, and that are highly, highly nutrient rich and come in small packages, which is extremely helpful when it comes to micronutrient consumption, as well as trying to replace other types of meats. We've been able to figure out through traditional ecological knowledge and regular old study, how we can farm these in ways that don't increase habitat loss in open air settings using nitrogen fixing plants that can allow communities to go from eating 11 of these bugs a year on average to over 3,000 in average within the first year of the introduction of the study, and in fact eat as many as 25,000. And this number is really important for the MAX because the most enthusiastic participants that we've had on this have been the people whose food systems really relied on forests the most in this case. So these ones who are doing 25% in farming aren't individuals that are already have, like poultry and chickens and all of these other food that's there. They're individuals that were relying the most on primate species, which is exactly who we were hoping to reach through these types of efforts. This type of work has increased dietary diversity really rapidly in the communities we work. We increased dietary diversity by 23% in the first year. We're in year 3 now. Things are going good. But in this context, what's important is that it has significantly affected lemur hunting. In the communities where we've actually been doing this project, we've seen a reduction in the first year by 30%, second year held 30%. Looks like our last year here will be the same each and every year in the number of lemurs that are hunted within these communities. Where we've seen lemur hunting continue to increase in the communities where we haven't done anything. And what's important in this is we're not going and asking for change in human behavior at all. All we're doing is really looking at and understanding the reasons why people are hunting, the role that forests play in food security, and trying to find ways to work with that system in order to improve the sustainability. And this has had a significant effect on primates. The last year, to be honest, has been really, really alarming with COVID and what we've seen happen with the densities of our primate population surrounding our communities. In communities where we are not doing things, we've seen a really drastic drop in the densities of diurnal primates surrounding where we've been working, which I'm really looking forward to getting back and checking in on the inside to see what's happening. But in the communities where we've improved the resiliency of the food system in ways that depend on forests, which are there, right, and that don't depend on these external food systems, we've been able to not only maintain primate populations, but increase their densities as well. And what I really want to drive home, I guess, or like share with you guys, it's not necessarily about lemurs or about bugs, but it's just that by understanding this connection between forests and people, we can really work with communities to design solutions that are culturally appropriate, that can improve food security and primate biodiversity at the same time by understanding this connection, which feels good, right? So I want to thank really quick before I turn it over to questions or anybody, the incredible people who I work with to make this happen. There are a lot of individuals who aren't here, my family who gets to do all this with me, the people who pay for this to take place, which is key, and to you guys who are doing probably amazing primatological work that I'm taking away your time from doing right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cortni. Really, really interesting work and important work. So if anyone has any questions for Cortni, please post them in the question and answer box on your Zoom function. I'll start with a question. In terms of thinking about solutions in other places, how sort of broadly do you think the solutions that you've established so successfully in the communities in which you work in Madagascar are applicable in other areas?
Yeah, I think that's key. So the main thing that is figuring out why, right? Is really understanding the reasons why people are doing the behavior that they're doing and starting there. So I think that's the most applicable piece, is when you're looking at conservation, it's not only going out, and if you're someone who's in the audience who wants to study something like this, don't just count how many and what is the impact, but in order to turn that around into action, really understand the reasons why something's taking place and how it fits within that greater system. So that's been fantastic and it's helped us adapt this. The bug is cool because it's all over Madagascar. which for a place that is this biodiverse, we've done pilot studies in the far south, in, I mean, you know, the wettest places, some of the driest places, and it's eaten and it's able to be farmed on over 72 different species of domestic and wild nitrogen fixing bean crop, which is great. It's also all over all of Central Africa. So if you overlap the highest biodiversity and the lowest food security, there's a really cool opportunity to help turn this into it. But I think it's mostly what's important to me in this is taking that understanding and looking at what's possible and the role that primates fill within the diet, and kind of recognizing that it's not just that any meat, you know, like meat's a meat, swap them out, is to really understand what that means in the culture there, what other foods can fill that, and then rely on the diversity of that system to help.
Great. Well, piggybacking off of that, Tiago's asking, does the community already eat insects, or was it a new food source for them? And you know, piggybacking off of that, is there a potential problem introducing it as a new food source in the communities that might not have eaten it?
Yeah, for us, we've never tried to introduce anything that's new. So for us, the first thing we did is we tried to understand everything that was eaten in the community. What's something you'd like to eat more of? How do you perceive it? Trying to find the things that would fit the same role as other wild meats in the diet. This was one that everybody really liked. It really does taste like bacon. We're calling it with the bacon bun often, but it's delicious. It's fatty. It's small packages. So it was already eaten a lot. And it seemed like there was the potential to increase the density in these kind of open areas around houses and fences because of some of the different host plants that they could use. We were just missing some of the like particular skills to understand the reproduction of the bug and when to harvest it and all that. So something everybody wanted to eat. I find that trying to convince anyone to do anything never works, right? Any of us immediately, if you tell us to do something else, we're like, no. So it's just trying to figure out something that people wanted already, what the barriers were to that, remove those barriers. And as soon as that happened, we've had a lovely increase in the consumption itself, which is great.
Great. Another question, what type of method do hunters use to capture and kill lemurs? And a density bias catchment profile may be driven by non-selective hunting methods. So
yeah. So it depends on where you are in Madagascar. Madagascar is a little different than some of the hunting in other, because it is driven primarily by trapping within, at least on the eastern sides. However, there is opportunistic hunting that's done as well. So most targeted hunting is through passive snare traps, but there are behavior specific passive snare traps. So not that anything can go in them, but they're based around fruit trees for frugivores, or, you know, like water sources for carnivores on common travel paths. Opportunistic hunting tends to be more with like slingshot and those types of things. That there's not as much targeted hunting. Down hunting is extremely low in this case. So we do make sure that we split out when we're looking at like, okay, well, if it's opportunistic, you're going to hunt what's there. What's interesting is that even with the trapping itself and some of the more targeted selective measures, so much of it depends on just eating what's there, even in the foods that they don't like. It's not like all primates taste the same, right? So some primates are not preferred food sources. And when you ask people about their preference for those species, they're less, but that doesn't actually affect the number that are eaten, because they'll still catch them even if they're there, which is interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. I think we have time for one more question now for Cortni, and then we'll return in the general question and answer session. Basically, how important is selling of meat and commercial hunting in Madagascar generally, and in the populations that you work with specifically?
Madagascar is different than mainland Africa this way. So Madagascar is a very unique scenario where we have over 98% of all hunting is subsistence-based hunting that's going to the household itself. So we do not have the large bushmeat markets that are really common in other places. And this gives us a really unique opportunity, I feel like, as a country, to take a scenario right now where we have not reached the peri-urban needs of meat that we do see in other countries as those populations grow and outstrip their food production systems, where we have a chance now to actually improve food security in ways to prevent some of that from taking place. So what we have is we actually have less than 2% of all meat that's caught that is actually sold, and most of it goes directly to the hunters' families themselves.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Cortni. And again, we'll have 2 more opportunities for you all to ask Cortni questions. But that, I think, is a really nice segue to our next presenter, who works in precisely the area that Cortni was just describing in mainland Africa. So Carolyn Jost Robinson is the Director of Sociocultural Research and Engagement at Chengeta Wildlife, excuse me, an organization that seeks to develop sustainable solutions to protect the integrity of important natural ecosystems, wildlife populations, and the human communities that depend on them. She's a broadly trained anthropologist with backgrounds in field conservation and studies of human-wildlife interactions. She has 12 years of experience in developing and directing collaborative research and community engagement projects across West and Central Africa. So thank you, Cortni. Sorry, Carolyn.
No problem. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Chris, for inviting me to be a part of this panel with some other really exceptional colleagues, and to ASP for organizing these webinar series. As you noted from my introduction by Chris and Cortni's perfect segue, I focus most of my research in mainland Africa, in West and Central Africa, specifically the Congo Basin. Go ahead and advance the slide. Great. So today I'm not going to focus so much on the generalized data of hunting offtake or market numbers, but I'm happy to take questions and answers or discuss that in the breakout rooms, or focus really on bushmeat markets specifically, or commodity chains. But what I do want to really address are the ways that we approach the topic, or the quote unquote problem of primate hunting and hunting in general, and really focusing, as my title indicates, on what counts in our considerations of the data we use to understand these complex systems, like Cortni described and like I'll be describing here. Following the sort of addressing of a problem, we'll talk a little bit about sort of how we can address history and reassess data when we're working to protect these integrated systems, to help us develop a better understanding of the shared ecologies of hunters and wildlife, including non-human primates. Next slide. Great. Sorry, I'm just making sure I started a timer for myself, sorry. Before I start, rather than put this at the end, I wanted to just take a note at the beginning to acknowledge the communities and contributors to my research and work over the years, the communities that I've worked with here in Central African Republic, where I'm calling in from today, and in West and Central Africa, really have shaped the kaleidoscope of the ways that I understand hunting, human-wildlife interactions, and these complex interconnected systems that circulate around human-wildlife relationships. It's the voices of the people in these pictures that I try to carry in my work when I'm trying to think about primate hunting differently. And I just wanted to give that note here so I don't get too rushed at the end. Next slide, please, Jennifer. Got it. Okay. So as Cortni's noted, right, in speaking specifically about Madagascar and talking about these very simplified inverse relationships we often hear about with regards to either declining biodiversity and increased impacts in human communities or vice versa, it's really not that simple, but the general original narrative in the beginnings of primate conservation, but when conservation biology as a discipline really emerged in response to the crisis of biodiversity loss, we were really starting to look at the way that changes in biodiversity may result in increasing impacts on human communities that could have positive, negative, or sometimes and rarely neutral effects, but really thinking about how the growing global trade and forest resources, hunting, political and economic instability, and agricultural expansion play into these. And that's something that we've been working on addressing. And when I say we, I mean many people beyond my own research team that's been addressed in the discipline for a number of years. Next slide. That being said, right, if it's been a topic in conservation circles and at conferences and in the literature and in management, natural resource management, where are we now? And the answer is, unfortunately, that we're kind of in the same place. Go ahead and go to the next slide. As Cortni highlighted, and I'll expand upon here, while we're still addressing a similar problem of a crisis of biodiversity loss with increasing or changing impacts for human communities. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've really taken into in conservation circles, looking at new layers, right, and in social science and anthropology, thinking about food insecurity, right? As Cortni highlighted in Madagascar, we see very similar situations here in CAR and in Southwest Cameroon, of the ways that food insecurity is heavily impacted by forest access or forest inaccess, right? And the way that this interplays with agricultural expansion, particularly in West and Central Africa, the expansion of large-scale oil palm plantations and rubber plantations. There's varied impacts for non-human primate communities and human communities, which of course plays directly into health and nutrition, our understandings of emerging infectious diseases, and additional layers that we seek to understand of loss of cultural practices and knowledge that can take place when we see shifts in primate hunting as they pertain to increased global and commercial trade, right? Shifting the way that subsistence hunting takes place. So as subsistence hunting decreases, oftentimes we note a loss of cultural practices and knowledge. And this, of course, is tied into these expanding markets, which leads to the last bullet point, which is convergent patterns of wildlife crime, which is something I've been more focused on in recent years, thinking about the ways that commercial scale hunting, whether it's large scale poaching for ivory or pangolin scales, often feeds into commercial bushmeat markets, and those patterns of what are sometimes called wildlife crime, when it's on an illegal commercial scale, intersect, unfortunately, with the trafficking of arms, the trafficking of humans, and the trafficking of drugs in a number of contexts. So it really makes the need for understanding the multi-layered context of primate hunting from the subsistence level all the way up incredibly important to our understanding the ways that geopolitical instability affect places where humans and primates are living in West and Central Africa. Advance to the next slide. So how can we address this? In the shortest version, we have to include diverse voices, and I put "we" in quotes, meaning to sort of just remind myself to note that in a lot of times in conservation biology, we, while it's meant to be an inclusive term, is actually quite limited, right? We have to remember that we're carrying the weight of the communities that we work with, the interlocutors that we engage with, that their voices also have to be a part of the story we're telling in primate hunting, that we have to be dynamic because commercial and even subsistence hunting practices are changing just as quick as daily life, and really thinking about the way we view data, which is what I'll talk more about in a moment. All these three things really play into reimagining the systems that we seek to protect and trying to force ourselves to, right, take a different perspective, right? As Cortni said in her work, they're not seeking to change behaviors, right? And I would echo the same context and say, rather than change behaviors, we seek to share perspectives or shift perspectives and find new avenues to move forward together. Okay, next slide. At a theoretical level, my own work engages multi-species approaches. I'm happy to talk more about that in the breakout. And the quickest version of that is thinking about the way that species and even objects really exist in relation to one another, so that sort of the way that meaning is derived for a non-human primate in the context of a hunter derives meaning from the existence of a non-human primate, and thinking about those interconnections between the two and their shared ecologies and how they change over time as technology and interventions change. In practice, the way we can reimagine these systems are through integrated methods, seeking to sort of look at what's around you, as Courtney described with the bacon bug, and how that can be integrated, right? We're not you're not introducing new behaviors, you're highlighting something that already exists. Shifting are the way we assess data, and most importantly, collaborating with hunters, right? Hunters are often painted as a villain in this scenario, but I spend a lot of time reminding individuals in management circles that hunters are also people, and that we have to consider what barriers are there in daily life that may lead them to make one decision or another, whether it's why they poached an elephant or why they've done this. We have to sort of step back and assess what barriers led an individual to make a particular decision. Next slide. So what counts as data? I really think this is important in primate and studying primate hunting in particular. Here on the left, you see pictures of a few things that in my past have counted as data. Cartridges found in the forest, fresh diker dung, a little bay diker backside there through the bushes, or an actual sighting of a primate. When you're studying primate hunting, this can be really complicated in West and Central Africa, where a lot of primate species actually change their behavior and become more cryptic. So you're relying more on vocalizations, which are very difficult to use in any sort of modeling, right? In terms of your ability to understand attenuation of sound, et cetera. You have to do a high number of sampling to get a sighting frequency that might allow you to model a population size, or you're relying on camera traps. One example I want to point out in terms of what counts as data is that hunter observations are often really quite commonly disregarded in the literature and publication process as counting as data, right? So myself personally, I've had several publications where hunter observations were not considered usable for a primate sighting, right? And this is important, particularly when we're studying certain species like red colobus that I work with that I study in Southwest Cameroon, where really some of our only sightings of these species are coming from hunters. And we're in fact using the hunters to help us find a group in the forest so that we can try to follow it. Yet, oftentimes we're not considering that or counting that as viable data when we're creating assessments and species threshold levels, or updating the status of species at a higher level. Next slide. In addition to that, I also want to sort of push everyone to consider the ways that how data counts, or how we consider it, varies across discipline, particularly in how people value wildlife and how this is viewed by others. And a number of reasons why wildlife are important to people are some of the ways that storytelling and cultural tradition allow people to engage or discuss their own social status or their own socio-political position within their community through animals themselves. And that this is just as important in our understanding of primates and primate hunting as anything else, right? The way that certain species figure in storytelling can tell us a lot about the way people engage with the environment and hunting. For example, the agile mangabey, which is both terrestrial and arboreal, plays a large role in certain aspects of one culture that I works with, traditional stories, because it has access to both spheres, the sky and the trees and the forest floor. So it's really important for hunters to be able to understand that particular animal. Next slide. And finally, I want to focus on collaboration. In thinking about bringing hunters into the work that we do in the Central African Republic, in 2008, 2009, I did my PhD work primarily with hunters here in southwestern Central African Republic. And in the last year, the hunting community themselves, the registered gun hunting community, who are legal hunters, have asked to begin a self-reporting survey where they themselves are monitoring the primates and the ungulates and the other species that are killed in any weekly forest trip by 12 particular hunters over 18 weeks thus far. And so to me, this was a really huge shift in our association and working with hunters, and that rather being a study where it was more of my, a lot of times researchers coming and taking data, here we have finally a real dialectic process between ourselves and the hunting community here, where the hunters are generating the data that we're also using to inform management, but also those data are presented each month back to the hunting association themselves. And they're getting finally their own very clear picture, right, of what's happening in the forest where they hunt, which was something that was requested at the beginning of the study, right, was to have a better idea of what impact legal gun hunting was having on the forest, so that they could better sensitize other hunters in the community. And in doing so, right, we shift sort of more of the illegal hunting into the legal sector, right, and it allows eco guards and game rangers in the area to focus their jobs, on their jobs that sort of on larger scale issues in the region, and local gun hunters then are able to sort of support and help sensitize local communities and really increase awareness about food security for themselves and their families. So we gain a lot, right? We gain a better relationship with hunting, a better understanding of what's happening in the forest over a longer term, and also more people, right, generating and sort of working together to find some of these solutions, right, that Cortni talked about, of behaviors that already exist that we can work together on for long-term primate conservation management. That's it.
Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. And again, just a reminder, post your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of the Zoom, your Zoom interface. I wanted to start by asking you, Carolyn, if there's any awareness or concern among hunters of zoonotic disease risk. Are they taking any precautions, especially the legal hunters?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, there are researchers here that have been working on zoonotic diseases, and including Elizabeth Hall coming from Purdue University, from my alma mater. Of course, it is something that individuals are aware of. You know, it was discussed more commonly during the most recent, you know, the most recent Ebola outbreak. And I wouldn't say it's something where there's necessarily extra precaution taken, but it's something that people, that communities are aware of, right? And of course, in conversations with market women as well, right? There's a number of different, you know, steps in the chain where public health education has to take place. I wouldn't say it's quite as common as in Southwest Cameroon, where I've worked, where there are consistent discussions, and during the 2013, 2015 period, right, where, you know, people were actually calling monkeys Ebola, right? Instead of saying they were selling monkey meat at their stand, they were selling Ebola. You know, so it was, you know, it generated a lot of discussion of the ways that where communities and market women would ask, you know, what are the precautions that you take? And you know, we found that public health education outreach is simply the best case, even in places where, right, in Corp National Park, where we were working at the time, where there has been no history ever of a large zoonotic disease outbreak, that communities were interested in having that information as sort of as a precaution, or to be prepared, right? You can't know what you're not prepared for when you're not prepared. And so that was something that people were really interested in that context.
Great. Another question: when you obtain data from hunters or interview them, do you make any payment to them as compensation?
in years, the simple answer is no, right? So sometimes an individual might be compensated with some sugar or something that's an important household item where, of course, there's the opportunity for the hunter to take a bag of sugar on a hunting trip with them, but it's also more likely that it'll end up at home for breakfast and coffee, right? But generally it's where you can't necessarily fuel the economy that you're seeking to study, which is a delicate balance when you are asking for a lot of someone's time or taking away from the actual process of hunting. So we try to strike a balance in some household items and soap and things like that are valued at the household level so that it sort of offsets a little bit of their participation.
One last question before we move to our next presenter. How can we upskill hunters and their families or the community they represent voices to build a fair and inclusive conservation strategy? What role does research have in building this?
That is an amazing question. I think it takes time, right? And it takes really sort of from the researcher perspective, I would encourage anyone studying primate hunting. It's difficult, but to put in those hours, meeting with management, meeting with the leaders of conservation in the area to discuss with them, why we need these voices, right? It seems very obvious to someone like myself who's been studying this that like these are the people in the forest, these are the men in the forest or the women, and engaging with the animals and knowing the most about the animals. But it's finding a way to sort of bring that into sort of the applied sector, right? Where they're, conservation generally, right? They need a silver bullet to meet funding deadlines and to be on a timeline that's often much shorter than what we have. But it's important, right, from the researcher perspective to do that work on the part of the communities that you work with and seek ways to bring them into the discussion with you, right? Maybe you're setting it up and then you're bringing a few hunters in to have a very open conversation about how could we as a community of hunters contribute to the broader mission of conservation. All hunters that I've ever worked with know that conservation and the long-term presence of biodiversity is in their best interests, right? At a household level, right? From a subsistence level. And even, right, for some of those that are hunting more commercially, but still commercially, but within like the same 10 village area, right? When you get to commercial international, right, that's a different level that you're speaking about. So, if you're seeking to raise up the voices of the people who are really relying, as Cortni says, for their food security, right, and to meet their daily nutritional goals, right, that's an important conversation to have. And you can help give them the data that lifts up what they're saying, right, about presenting their own data about their own health.
Great. Well, that's another wonderful transition. You guys are making my job easy here. So thanks so much, Carolyn. And our last presenter is Roselis Mazurek, who's a fellow at the Local Heritage, Environment and Globalization Unit of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, France. She's been working closely with indigenous communities in Brazil for more than 2 decades, particularly as an ethnoecologist focused on sustainable resource use and participatory conservation. Her current project involves supporting territorial and natural resource use management and capacity building for sustainable development in indigenous lands and among riverine communities in Amazonia. Thank you so much. Roselis.
Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me well?
Yes. Yeah.
Jennifer, can you share my presentation?
I think you're sharing, right? If you click that green button at the bottom.
Yes, sorry.
No, that's okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start my presentation. Mas só uma particular study on resistance hunting that I have done recently with forest people in the Central Amazon forest to discuss the importance of indigenous people and indigenous lands to conservation in present day.
Roselis,
Yes.
your audio is a little bit fuzzy.
Is it better now?
Perfect, perfect.
Okay, so I just have to be closer to the computer. One second. I did this study, was a hunting study, and in the Waimeria-Trori area. It's a Caribbean-speaking people who lived in central Amazonia in an area of 25,000 square kilometers. It was not only focused on primates, it's hunting in general, but I'm going to present data on primates. Sorry, my English. So I did a 1-year subsistence hunting and fishing study. It was the late 90s. And I observed, I did a collaborative work with indigenous people. And we had data for 1,369 days of hunting, where we recorded everything that was hunted in 14 villages and hunting camps. The idea of the research project was that the Indians were becoming more sedentary. The villages used to move more, and they start to stay more time in one place because government was providing education and external health support. And this was changing the way they are moving into the territory. There are around 10 species of primates in the area, according to studies. But the main focus of the hunting among the Waimiri were cebids, these 3 species: the howlers and the capuchin monkeys and black spider monkeys. I must tell that the use of wildlife here is only for consumption. There is no commercial, and it's just for subsistence. The results of this research was that primates, they represented 24.5% of all individual species hunted. It was like 110 tons of game, and primates represented 9%. There was like the focus was for howler monkeys and tuft capuchin monkeys. Males were more hunted, more than is their occurrence in natural surveys, indicating they were choosing more these animals. And in this case, males are bigger than females. This didn't happen to spider monkeys. Bringing these hunting practices, the current circumstances, in the case of the Waimiri, they still hunt in the same way. There was no changes in like hunting technology or anything. They still preserve the large territory that now is large and surrounded by large tracts of forest. Population has doubled, but they have kept the sizes. Even villages increased in numbers as well. They remain in small sizes. So you have small population densities with large tracts of forest in between. So hunting in this case is more likely to produce just localized effects without having much impact on the monkey population, considering the situation of the Waimiri. Primates primates beyond food. They are present in the Waimiri cosmology, and the golden-handed tamarin in mythical times. He was an Indian. These stories, these myths are from times when the boundaries between humans and animals were not distinct. So he was an Indian who, in a time when there was no night, only day, and he decided to touch the sun, and he broke the sun. And as a punishment, a deity called Mawaf, or the Waimiri, transformed him into a monkey and make his hands gold to remind him of what he has done as a punishment. The Waimiri, they have several food taboos related not only to monkeys, but particularly to monkeys. And capuchin monkey and spider monkeys are taboos are associated with pregnancy and postpartum periods. And the taboos apply not only for the pregnant woman, but also to the husband. Since hunting is very, we are talking about different countries. I'm going to talk a bit about how is the hunting legislation in Brazil. Hunting was allowed until 1967, was completely prohibited in the country. There are exceptions for people, for subsistence hunting that on protected areas that allowed traditional local people that need wildlife for survivorship, but this needs to be done under management rules. And their livelihoods depend directly on wildlife. Sport hunting is only allowed for control exotic species, and wildlife meat can be sold legally only from captivity. Of course, very low enforcement, and especially in Amazonia with enormous low governance, these laws do not prevent very little. There is a highly profitable illegal trade of wildlife. So indigenous people have a different, distinct legislation from other citizens in Brazil. And our constitution recognizes that the indigenous people have the originary rights to live the way they live according to their own cultural ways, that has been developed and reproduced over generations. So if they engage in commercial use of natural resources, they must follow current environmental laws. Just to show you one slide of how wildlife is important, not only as a nutritional value, but also the ways it's prepared. This is a way that the Kayapó Indians from southeastern Amazonia cook their food, burying banana leaves and cooking on over burning rocks and buried on the ground. It's called the berarubu. And this is a sample of a hunting and fishing excursions, the results. So concerning the importance of indigenous lands and the way they live for conservation of the Amazon ecosystems, I'm gonna show you here is the Brazilian areas. The Amazon is on the north, and all these green areas represent indigenous territories. The larger ones are located on the north, and you can see some on the south, but nothing compared to the Amazon. 90% of the indigenous lands in Brazil are located in the Amazon, and they represent 21% of the whole Amazon region, representing enormous conserved areas. And here I am presenting a map that shows in dark green indigenous lands, in light green conservation units or protected areas that are or national parks or extractive reserves in the area that they occupy in Amazon. Is 44% of the Brazilian Amazon is under some protection law. what not necessarily means that they are effective. In general, they are the protected areas are low, well equipped with little personnel, and in current day Brazil, the environmental laws are being severely attacked by government. The effects of indigenous territories having conservation, even without any support, just the presence of indigenous people can't prevent some scale of illegal invasion. This happens. It's just for them being there can inhibit it. The way they live in general, they produce very little low impact considering their subsistence practices. More and more, this is not a general for all indigenous areas, but they have been more engaged on using other non-forest products as a form of generating income, diversifying the use of forest resources that are already there, but to, in some cases, shifted them from being involved in predatory activities like it was the case in the past, like the selling of timber and involvement in gold mining activities. To give you a picture of what is going on in the Amazon now, here is a graph of the deforestation in the last 10 years. And what has been happening, particularly in the last 2 years with our change in government. There was an increase in nearly 70% in deforestation in the last 2 years compared to the previous 10-year rates. Of this deforestation, just to show the role of protected area and indigenous lands in 2020, of a total of almost 11,000 square kilometers deforestation, indigenous lands and protected areas had the lowest levels of deforestation, even being sometimes very badly equipped and with no personnel. So they really represent protection for the forest and for the forest ecosystems. Here's just to show you where the indigenous lands have been more affected by deforestation and illegal gold mining. In the map, you see the indigenous lands in green, and all the red areas are deforestation. You can see many is related to roads, but all the eastern and southern Amazonia is severely deforested. But you can see you also have some in the indigenous areas, but very, very little in comparison. Current threats to the indigenous territories now. Particularly, this was a problem for a long time, but now it has doubled, threefolded. The number of invasions and deforestation had increased amazingly. And this has also been elevating COVID infections for indigenous people, mostly through gold miners. Some of these areas are with more than 20,000 gold miners, illegal, extracting gold in their areas. And accompanying deforestation, you also have fires because the forest gets drier and fires, illegal, criminal fires, are put to cut and eliminate the forest. Illegal gold mining has also increased, and particularly because you have verbal incentives, or there are projects in the House of the Representatives and with incentives of the federal government saying that they're going to change the legislation, allowing mining in indigenous land. And even if this doesn't really happen yet, just the fact that they are talking about works as an incentive and makes people invading lands, and it has been a big problem. Infrastructure projects like road, hydroelectric dams, they also have amazing impacts on indigenous communities directly and indirectly. Roads allowed more people to come to the areas and make it easier the extraction, illegal extraction of natural resources. Hydroelectric dams, they cover, flood a lot of areas in the Amazon because the height of the Amazon basin is very low. Also changes the pulses of the waters that regulate so much of the fishing migration and the life in the rivers on whose the people depend on. And more, there are dangerous moves in the Congress with a lot of lobbyists for changing protective legislation in Brazil concerning all the possibility of extraction gold mining without previous consultation of indigenous people. They want to change the land demarcation process that is only an administrative one, but they want the Congress to decide if this can be an indigenous land and include the revision of the limits. So we are living a very dangerous moment particularly for indigenous people. As my concluding remarks for this presentation, indigenous territories play an important role in protecting Amazon forest, biodiversity in its ecosystems. Conservation efforts should include supporting indigenous people in their decision-making process concerning their territorial rights and livelihoods. And current political situation has placed even more pressure on indigenous people and their territories, and urgently needs to be restrained. Thank you. Sorry for my English.
No apology necessary. Thank you so much, Roselis. Really, really interesting and urgent work. I think we have time for just one quick question for Roselis, and then we'll open it up for all of the panelists. So to what extent has commercial hunting of wildlife increased among the indigenous populations in Brazil? Is that an issue instead of just simply subsistence hunting? And if so, has that affected primates at all?
There aren't much registered on. This is not an issue for indigenous people. It is outside. Commercial illegal wildlife trade focus a lot on birds, but monkeys as well. But I don't have data on outside of indigenous. But for indigenous people, it's not an issue at all.
Okay, well, I want to take about 10 minutes here to open up questions for all panelists. And I'll start, I think, an important question at this time where we're all cognizant of the current pandemic that we're living in that has really altered our lives in almost every way. So given the risk of zoonotic disease transmission, which may be higher in some areas than others, but especially from primates and rodents, how can wild meat hunting and consumption be practiced safely? So if it is possible that hunting and conservation can go together, how can that be done in a safe way? Does anyone want to jump in?
Is not exactly my field, but what I concerning the situation in indigenous territories, I think most of the zoonotic disease come from animals that are raised, or at least this is what I hear, in Amazonian territories, if you maintain the forest and where the natural mechanisms of control are there, you're not confining animals, you're not placing them in a place to sell. I think this contributes. I actually don't even hear about this issue here.
I think that's such a great point, such an important point.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Karen.
I was just gonna say, I mean, it's hard to really know where to start, but one thing I would just always, point out is we need to have these conversations with hunters or bushmeat sellers, and people generally in and out of the forest. It's also a lot of times equally, if not more important, with regard to zoonotic infections, to talk about the social contact, right? And what happens after that one species jump, right? Making people aware of it is really important, and there are different strategies of doing that we've used in our own work, of using like crop foraging as an example. Like when an elephant comes, everything goes away, but often, which is more like in a pandemic situation, or versus like when a cane rat comes to your crop and it's insidious and there every day, but you're not really seeing the damage. And so talking to people about diseases in a different context that makes more sense, but really work a lot on focusing on the human part, like what can we do after the fact.
I was just going to mention too, Rosalie's making the great point about the importance of intact ecosystems for preventing zoonotic emergence, as well as the threat from domestic animals, which I think sometimes doesn't seem to make its way into conversations about wildlife hunting and zoonotic disease, especially when people start thinking about stopping wildlife hunting, but not thinking about the importance of domestic animals and industrialized food production in the spread of zoonotic disease as well. I think, Carolyn, you brought up such a really broad, important point, and I wanted to push all three of the panelists. And you talked a little bit explicitly about how we do this in the question answer, but how do we, to borrow your quotation marks, Carolyn, how do we include diverse voices more effectively in global conservation, especially given its long history and, in fact, origin in colonialism?
I can say that just by actually going to the people and asking, I'm often amazed, right? Where like sometimes you hear in so many conversations about the stories about hunting or things. And if you've asked, like, has anyone gone there and actually spoke with hunters or the communities themselves before starting regulations and things like that? And oftentimes it doesn't happen as often, or there's like a fear that those communications will be like awkward or combative or I found that communities are extremely welcoming and open, at least in Madagascar, to being a part of this and being a part of those conversations. And I feel very lucky in that sense. So just being there from the very beginning and listening, as silly as that sounds, is really just a part of the huge step. And then also making sure that we're really working to empower the local capacity in the communities where we work, and lift up those individuals as well, to make sure that we're not always hiring, and even in simple ways, right? People who speak, English outside of the community, but learning the local language, training, capacity building, so that we can always make sure that the people that we're working with, we're hiring in the communities we work, and empowering these in as many ways as we can.
I think in Brazil, because we had so many people living in the Amazon suffering the pressure, there was an urgency of them to organize themselves. So we have a lot of areas, the indigenous people are very organized as a result of the need. Otherwise, they want to resist. So this is what is happening here. It's not, of course, you can hear there, not in many cases, indigenous people have the support of NGOs, because sometimes the government is fighting against people now. What the work that I've been doing is on territorial planning is speaking with indigenous representatives in the area, discuss where are you now with your territory, where do you want to be, what are your main issues. So we construct what are their priorities and help them to find support for what is more urgent now. It's land protection. So through partnership and, and deal with that. In the case of where I'm working, Northeast Amazonia, acai berry is very abundant, is a extractive product. So they wanted us to have so much acai. We need some income. So we started doing management in the area and looking for better commerce or improving the productivity of acai. And this is how we are doing.
Another question that I think is one that a lot of us have on our mind right now. How has the COVID pandemic influenced or changed your research or work?
For us, it's been, I mean, like one, I'm sitting here in New Jersey, right? You know, as opposed to being in the field, which has been I think it also just kind of, it goes back to what you were talking about with your last question, is that I feel so lucky that, you know, that I have a team that is still there every single day collecting this data that's part of these communities that we can continue to rely on. The impacts on the primates themselves have been really alarming that we've seen in that. And I'm really hoping the source sync dynamics are helping to hold it. But I think it's just, I think it's really reminded us about this importance and the connection between, you know, like wildlife and people in all of these ways, and how much we depend on the local communities and the people that we work with to be there for us, and what a huge part they really are of all the work that we do.
Carolyn, do you have here, are you able to hear us all right? I was just curious how COVID has affected your work.
Yeah, I'm here. I mean, quite a bit. You know, we were, of course, as everyone, unable to travel and things like that. With regard to a lot of the work that we do as an organization at Chingeta, right, it was to keep, you know, some people were stuck in the field, some people were stuck out in the field, some people were stateside. With regard to research, you know, things have really come to a stop. But as I think I sort of just caught the back end of what Cortni was saying, one thing that I think has been like a macabre silver lining in a weird way is that in a lot of cases, you know, projects that large international organizations you would say I have to be on the ground to do. I was really happy that I couldn't be there because the teams on the ground are so capable, if not more capable than me, that it became very clear what the real capacity of the community members is by happenstance, right? And so I think it took a lot of projects even further forward in that sense.
Great.
In my
to see
case,
how well it can happen, right? Working myself out of a job in this case is a good thing.
Go ahead, Celeste.
in my case, it came to a stop, particularly because indigenous people are more vulnerable. The rate of the death rate is higher than outside of the reservations for multiple reasons. Also because they live in distant areas. If you get sick, by COVID from a gold miner until you have the time to get to a major city. You know, you just because of the access. And if you want to consider the Amazon state, the one of the largest in the Amazon, has 62 cities, and only the capital has intensive care facilities. So, you know, but one interesting thing with COVID, particularly in Eastern Amazon, in the Oiapoque indigenous lands, they have an intense contact with non-indigenous society. They provide most of the manioc flour to the markets in the cities, and all that stopped. So suddenly they relied more on forest products during the pandemic. The acai consumption like exploded internally. So that was also give the importance of having that there in good shape. So this was an interesting thing to say.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, and they've been all vaccinated.
Oh,
And
great.
so they were fighting, they were included in the priority groups and are vaccinated. We're having a little problems with evangelic that say that it's things of the devil, and many Indians are refusing to take vaccination, but we are going to get there.
I'm so glad you mentioned that the resilience of the indigenous groups, that we've seen the same with our partnership in Guyana, where there's that sort of empowerment that we aren't reliant on these outside goods. We're better able to deal with this than a lot of other populations in Guyana or Brazil. Great. Well, I think now we're going to go to breakout room. So I'll hand it over to Bert for last minute announcements.
Whoops, I thought I was sharing my slide, but I unshared my slide, sorry. So thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have enjoyed the event as much as I have. I want to thank all of our participants, presenters, and I also want to remind you that the ESP Conservation Committee is hosting this event and really appreciate your generosity in supporting our effort to fund primate research. As noted earlier, we're now moving to the after-party Zoom meeting. The new link has been sent to all of you by email during the past hour and a half or so. I received about 90 minutes ago. So we're going to close down this part of the webinar and hope to see you all in the breakout rooms in just a few minutes. So again, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.